Next, I'd like to bring up Neri Singh of Accenture Digital, whose title is somewhat long, but I'm going to read it. Managing Director, Head of Digital Business for Europe, Africa, and Latin America, and has fascinating history himself. I don't know if he'll get into it, but used to be in the game business and has done a bunch of different things. But I'm going to let him describe his panel, and I'm very excited to hear it. So it does include Morgan, who replaced Dave Morgan of Simul Media, who was unable to get here.
Great. Thank you, Dave, and thanks for all of you to allow us to be over here. We have a fascinating panel ahead of us. The two areas that we're going to touch base about is briefly talk a little bit about what's relevant and what might be happening in the media industry over the next 12, 24 months, what's overhyped, what's underhyped, and really talk about how that's, and the implications of some of that in terms of some of the incumbents that have managed to reinvent themselves. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to include Google as an incumbent. Although a slightly unusual one. So with that, let me just start it off with Margot and Martin. Welcome to the panel.
Thank you.
Let's just get straight into it. We'll probably have a very active discussion and then break it up for Q&A and get you guys to ask any questions you have about the companies, about the reinvention, about what you see happening in the media space. Margot, let me just start with you. In terms of the past year, 24 months, and what you see going forward, anything that you see in terms of the media industry, any trends, anything significant, things that are overhyped or underhyped?
So if I think about the big trends looking forward, and a lot of these are well-trod, so, but when I put some of them together, I mean, there's no question that the consumer's in charge. And the whole world of linear television, I think, has to evolve, because consumers are really voting with their feet. I think we see it right now in the fall lineups and how things are progressing, that the world really has changed. But in addition to that, I think we all talk about how content is king. And I think we're definitely moving to a space where content plus data are king, because people really want to understand their audiences. Even the TV industry is working hard. I'm sure a lot of people saw the Comcast article to really understand who are the people that are watching their shows. It's not just the amount of audience you have, but the intensity, how engaged that audience is. And also the opportunity to interact with them becomes increasingly important. And then the growth of smartphones and ubiquity, and as data plans, as one of the other panels talked about, are more universally available. I think we're going to see more and more globalization of properties. We see some of that already in the main digital, but even properties like Daily Mail are becoming really, truly global properties.
Got it. And when you say things like content and data and mobile phones and things like that, any tipping points or anything significantly changing in the next 12, 24 months as far as you see it?
And if I think about the next 12 to 24 months, I think what we're really seeing is a huge movement to video. You were asking about this earlier. The consumer really is fallen in love with video. You see it on every single platform. It's really accelerating. YouTube sort of started it, but now you see it everywhere. It's on Facebook, it's on Instagram, et cetera. It's just a format that consumers love. Publishers are really leaning into it as well. Most of this, in my view, is driven by the plethora of smartphones. When you're on a smartphone, it's much easier to watch something than read something. I think most of us reflexively, just as human beings, I don't know about anybody else, but I don't read directions anymore. I just go to YouTube and look for someone else to explain how it actually works. And it's often not even the company, it's just someone else who's posted a video on that product or service. And I just think it's becoming so much a part of our lives and how we think about getting information. I think that's a huge change.
I'd love for you to think about something that you've heard or seen incessantly in the last 12 months that you think is overhyped. We'll come back to that. Martin, from your point of view, I think most people will be surprised, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Daily Mail, the General Trust, some of the numbers, which are pretty staggering. But as far as you guys see it, what do you see as relevant? What do you see as a shiny object that might not matter 2 years from now?
Well, I think we see, of course, not surprisingly, very similar trends. I would add also for us as a content producer, having to make decisions about distributing our content on an increasing number of platforms and what kind of relationships to have with those platforms. And of course, that combination of content and data, and having the data on your customer so that you're close to your customer, you know your customer. And of course, some platforms are more open to that than others. So I think that for us is a major sort of series of strategic decisions coming up. Then also there's more talk, of course, about ad blocking, how that's going to work out. And it's not a big issue for us yet, but it's something I would say that we're constructively nervous about. And how can we persuade our readers to make sure they don't block us out, especially if they're not paying to access, I think is another topic.
So just on ad blocking a little bit, and this is, I mean, there's been a lot of discussions around this. As you both see it, is it more of just the consumer being more in charge and the mobile web having a reasonably, let's just say, character building experience? Or is it a calculated move by others in the industry to kind of make the mobile web a lot less relevant?
I think it could be both. It appears to be a calculated move on the part of certain companies that we don't need to mention. But face it, from a consumer point of view, if your experience is degraded by serving ads in various ways that aren't very effective, then I think as your consumer, you're quite right to perhaps complain about that and look to the publishers to deal with that problem. Right. I don't know how you feel, Margaret.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think the whole internet landscape on the media side has been so enabled by free content that's then funded by advertising. But at the same time, I think as an industry, it's really important that we have some standards that create consistently great user experiences. What I think concerns us is that all publishers are, in many of those situations, are swept into the same, treated by the same brush, even though many of them are great actors that have excellently targeted advertising that's very thoughtful and useful to the user. And so what I think is so important is that we get together as an industry, we have shared standards, and the publishers that really have those great standards are not subjected, because we do need to pay the publishers. They're investing a lot of money to create this content, and it's very important for an ecosystem that we find a viable model that works both for consumers and for advertisers.
Right.
And for us, a lot of that's driven by ads that give users choice, either exceptionally relevant, as we sort of started with search ads, or things like TrueView, where the consumer can choose to watch or skip the ad.
Right.
Which I think gives you a lot of feedback and insight about what consumers care about and how to do very relevant targeting.
We'll come back to if you think there's anything over or underhyped in terms of media trends. Just back to video, you talk about video. I somewhat cheekily mentioned Google as an incumbent. When it comes to video, is Google feeling like an incumbent, as some would argue? I mean, in terms of, do you see a new generation of video upstarts that come out there that could change the video landscape?
So I think video is here to stay. It's this incredible new format. A lot of people talk about linear television as video as well. So I think consumers love great content. I think what we're seeing in the way I think you're referring to video is not just the premium content that's created in traditional linear television, but this plethora, which started with user-generated content, but now tons of creators coming out into the space and finding whole new venues and types, more authentic creative. My sense is that growth will never stop, because it's so endemic to what consumers are looking for today, which is that much more authentic voice that's really speaking to them, that opportunity to engage and participate with the creator. YouTube clearly started this movement in a very proactive way. It's very much at the cornerstone of the ethos of the company, which is to democratize creativity and give everyone a voice. And not allow anyone who has a creative message to really find an audience for it, if there is one. There are many other platforms that will be created, some with more narrow interest areas, some just around fields like gaming, some will do it around different areas, and we're responding to that also as YouTube. So things like creating specialized apps for gaming and music and kids. Those are really important use cases where we know that the user wants a much more focused experience. So not only, I think, will there be a lot more choices for users, but I think larger players like ourselves will continue to observe how people use our platforms and think about ways in which we need to evolve our offering so that we stay in step with those usage occasions.
And Martin, from your standpoint, video, anything? I mean, obviously it's a huge part of kind of how you guys are moving.
Yes, well, I mean, I think for us, for example, it's beginning, as we get better at doing it, and it's evolving very quickly, I think it's giving us opportunities to think about doing, say, longer form video. You might call it a television program, which we might have not have perceived just a few years ago. So I think there are tremendous opportunities there. We'd be very brave to say there aren't going to be new businesses starting up that are going to disrupt some of us. So we have to look for that. But on the other hand, that might create some investment opportunities for us as well. Indeed. But it feels like a very natural evolution, at least for us as a content publisher video. It doesn't, It doesn't sort of feel like a massive step change. Oh my gosh, I think we've evolved into it pretty quickly and pretty naturally.
And we'll come back to a little bit about kind of how you guys have transformed yourself around digital and some of the numbers.
Right.
Just very quickly, I have to kind of go back to that. Anything that you see is completely overhyped or overspoken in this industry that you wish would stop?
No, I can't think of anything particularly, actually. It's very risky to say so, isn't it, by the way? Anyway.
We're only being streamed.
Yeah.
All right.
And I think there's a lot of discussion. You read tons of articles about cord cutting.
Yeah.
I think there's no question that consumers are interested in looking at options to unbundle, but I think it'll take a while for that to really play out. So I think many of these changes, you do see a slow and steady,
Right.
change, but I think it's going to, those are really 5 to 10 year, not 2-year changes.
Agreed.
But important to look at the fundamentals, though, of why users are doing that and what it is they're looking for, and begin to experiment and push the thinking now, so that you're ready for where we end up.
Agreed. Just switching topics a little bit. Martin, I'm not so sure most would appreciate the size and scale of kind of the digital footprint that the Daily Mail and the General Trust have established. Can you just take us, it's a 120-year-old institution. Can you just take us through some stats and kind of, what you guys have done and some potential lessons learned for those in the audience and beyond?
Well, I think you were referring particularly to Mail Online.
Yes.
Yes, which we've got about 225 million uniques a month now, about 14 million daily uniques. It's roughly a third UK, third US, third rest of the world. Although I noticed, I was just looking that the US is now somewhat larger than the UK, which is very exciting. And we're doing about roughly $100 million of revenue with a largely female demographic, which is very typical of what the newspaper was. So,
Right.
And I think this topic of global is very interesting, very exciting for us. And kind of who would have thought that a British, middle market tabloid newspaper could now have a global, has a global brand, and with a global opportunity. I think somebody from The Guardian perhaps is here. I don't know, The Guardian is a similar kind of opportunity. So that's hugely exciting to sort of break out of our domestic market, which is very typical of DMGT overall, that started out 20-odd years ago to diversify into different kinds of businesses and also globally. So we now have about 75% of our profits actually come from business to business rather than consumer.
Right. And just, Margaret, this applies to kind of a lot talked about recent structural changes of Alphabet. I think you've made some structural changes in terms of organizing for kind of digital reinvention. What are some lessons learned? What do other news or media organizations don't get about the importance of structure along this journey for reinvention?
Well, I think for us, we could stick with Mail Online. In some ways, it was a somewhat messy process in the early days. We didn't get it right off the bat. It wasn't as though somebody walked in with a fully formed business plan, and this is what we've executed. So I think in a funny way, what we got right was perhaps a little bit analogous to, a startup business that has an idea but doesn't get it right the first time and has to pivot it a number of times. So I think whether by design or whatever, we got it right in being relatively patient. And of course, critically, along came a brilliant person and the editor and publisher of Martin Clark, who had that has that messianic, fanatical zeal of an entrepreneur, to succeed. And, that I think really kind of trigger. You need that as well. So we're pretty clear believers, and not alone, that where you're looking to do new things, create new product, you have to create a good degree of space. Not necessarily send them completely to a different place, although that can work. In the case of Mail Online, it wasn't really that. But fairly early on, they got enough freedom from the newspaper business to actually create a different product.
But you also incented them differently, which I found interesting.
Yes, we incent differently. And we do this particularly when we invest in earlier stage entrepreneurial business, which we do a lot of, is, again, allow the freedom, but also share the value creation. So in a way, we try to mimic, in a way, what a venture capital firm would do, a private equity firm, is actually reward in a very different way than just a share of the profits or share of the sort of short-term cash flow. And we would do that inevitably over quite a long term. Right. And we try to emphasize the long term. And we're very lucky being a family-controlled, fourth-generation family-controlled business, albeit a public company, that it's very much my remit as a CEO to take a long-term view. And perhaps not everybody has that luxury, but and we try to make a virtue out of that.
Isn't there a danger of it creating kind of a have and have not employee base, those that get equity and other cool startup people, and those that are just regular, keeping the lights on?
I think there is a danger there, yeah. But on the other hand, we do know that our future has to come from more than just sort of incremental improvement, that we have to have some genuine innovations. And that's difficult, and that breaks things occasionally. And when you have really brilliant, creative people, they're difficult very often, but that sort of goes with the territory. So I'm not overall too worried about that. And we were talking earlier, and I think it's really, really important, particularly with software engineers and everything, you can provide really interesting work, because you're simply not going to compete on the talent thing if all what your people are doing is working on legacy systems and whatever. So, but there's a lot of that you can actually outsource, right? You can stick it into the cloud. You can send it abroad. I mean, you can be more aggressive of trying to move out the old and concentrate on the new.
Does Alphabet, the structure, the philosophy, the thinking apply to other industries?
So if I go back to maybe the session that was before us on values, at the end of the day, what drives us is that the ethos that Larry and Sergey created, organize the world's information, really has translated into improve the daily lives of as many people as possible. And I do think as the company grew, and Larry really felt that we're only 1% of the way to where computer science can really change lives, that if we really want to make a difference, that we have to find a way to leverage ourselves. And if you think about with machine learning, all the massive changes that can be taken on in so many different industries, all those things we're doing in driverless cars, in life sciences, in access, those things are massive problems that are 5 to 10 year bets. Very challenging if your core business is internet software and you really have massive innovation coming there too, right? We've gone from the desktop to the mobile web to apps and now moving on to a service web. We have a lot of innovation to be had there. How do we as a management team find leverage? And I think Larry very much felt that as a leadership team, we have to find a way to scale ourselves and scale himself.
Right.
Because if all those things were coming up to him as the CEO, that was going to be really tough. And he worked really hard to think about who could take the baton in the core internet software business so that he could, and very much inspired by the Berkshire Hathaway model, think about the insights that we have into fundamental technology trends and create this other business that could get after some of these big, huge, game-changing areas. And also, as I think it was mentioned, it was a constructive way in which we could respond to shareholders. So I think what other companies can learn is you sort of start with your fundamental ethos, and then you ask yourself, are you really overweighting the future?
Right.
And are you taking enough risk to really put those 5 to 10 year bets in areas that do attach to your core business? But he wanted to push the boundaries of kind of business assumptions, that everything has to be kind of deeply connected. In fact, you can move much faster if you can put really, really smart people in charge of things and then selectively bring your expertise over to those where you can really make a difference and try not to let those people slow down. In many ways, similar to this concept of having almost those in-house entrepreneurs. So you have the core capabilities, but you don't let that imprison you in terms of pace.
I'm just going to open it up to the audience for a few questions, but just let me ask you a totally random question. If your kid wanted to become a journalist, would you encourage them?
Yeah, I certainly would. I think there's huge opportunities in the digital world as in the print world, but this in a way comes back to values, isn't it? And I think it does inform our organization, that very competitive world of journalism, and getting something valuable out there that is engaging and is important to people.
All right. I'll open it up to a few questions and go from there. Yes, please.
Hello, Ken Washington from Ford. I wanted to ask the panelists if you could comment on some of the disruptions that are happening in the media world. I'm fascinated about how it's reinventing itself so many times. It didn't start with, but one of the big disruptions was Twitter. I mean, we're all tweeting about this today, and that's becoming a major news outlet. Over the weekend, I read a very eye-opening article in Fast Company about how Snapchat is bursting onto the scene, about creating this new media format, with this disruptive new business model for bringing fresh content to consumers. And so, without focusing just on those two, it just seems like media is a business where there's this reinvention that's happening with all these new outlets and new business models. I'd like to ask you to comment on that, and what's your reaction to it, and how are you positioning to either ride that wave or challenge it?
Well, I think you're right. It's certainly there's tremendous reinvention, and I can't see why that wouldn't continue. So it's one of those things: glass half empty, glass half full, right? I mean, on good days you think it's full of opportunity, and it can be quite unnerving. But on the other hand, coming to values, certainly our chairman, his great passion is great product. I mean, it's really focused on the product, and I think we've been around 120 odd years. So if you can keep that gene of adaptability, in our case, we're running a portfolio, so we're kind of spreading our bets, and we range everywhere from backing the occasional startup to, we've got in a newspaper a very cash generative, very old business. So that's one of the ways we're coping both with the risk and the opportunity, is run a kind of portfolio and give individual talented people a lot of freedom to go and do their stuff, because ultimately I think those are the people you're competing with, right?
Yep.
I think the fundamental piece of that is distribution is so much easier. So if you have a great idea, it's so much easier to scale it from a media perspective than it was before. It used to be that distribution was the choke point for creativity. And so I would anticipate that we'll just keep seeing more of these. I think the best ones are where people really see a user problem. So many of these new messaging apps did come from the fact that people wanted a disposable communications outlet. And that in and of itself as a thesis will then spur more ideas and innovation. So we're, I think, very much at the beginning stages, because if you look at how many apps people really use regularly, they download about the same number, but then they don't continuously use them. So I do think we're going to see a lot of huge number of new ideas coming in, and then it'll be interesting to see how many of those truly scale to the same levels and how they sort out.
There's a question back there. Mark?
Hi, Mark Bonchak, Shift Thinking. My question's about a future of advertising. We're moving beyond a one-to-many world, and so we can now have a relationship. We don't have to have transactional advertising. Is the use of data for more targeted, relevant advertising a kind of, will it reach a point of diminishing returns? Will we go to sponsorship models like the old soap operas? You look at Nike and Nike Plus, Coke and the Freestyle. These are kind of new vehicles for interaction that aren't about advertising. Are we going to see some kind of innovation there?
Martin, what do you see from?
Yeah, well, just like my answer to the earlier question, I'm certain that we're going to continue to see innovation. My sense is that all of the things you mentioned will continue to exist in some form. I'm actually very interested, I don't know about anybody else, and that I'm hearing quite a bit more recently about a topic about context. You may have the reader, you may have some demographic, but what is the context in which that advertisement actually showed up? Does it show up, and this is an old notion in media, does it actually show up against some content that is irrelevant, and it looks good and it feels good for the user? So that's a kind of somewhat old-fashioned idea, but I hear that coming up more in the digital arena. So but you would have more to say on this than me, probably.
Yeah, I think we're really excited about where this can go from a user experience perspective. Obviously, always with the appropriate permissions, because users are giving us their trust, and so their needs always have to come first. But when you think about what's possible in a world of smartphones, where you have so many different interactions with users today, your ability to understand what's important, their intent in context, we sort of call those incredibly important micro moments, where you as a brand or a partner can be with that user all along their journey, understand where they are and what they're doing, and be able to have a far more relevant interaction than we've ever done before. I think we're just at the very early innings of this, and I think programmatic is one way of thinking about automation, but the real promise of programmatic is that we can be truly audience-centric and help people, right, give them the right information at the right time to really make a difference.
And I would just add to that, and then you probably have to stop and we can take questions even away from the panel. I think the right balance, of course, is a very delicate balance between creepy and charming. So I think context is wonderful, but I think some of these ads that we've all started to see have become slightly borderline uncomfortable depending on the over-contextualization. I want to thank Martin, Margot. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And again, we're over here for questions. Thanks again, everybody.